Abigail was a woman full of dreams, but her reality was far from glamorous. Working as a maid in the Grand Wilmark Mansion in New York City, she knew the loneliness hidden behind marble walls. Every day, her life was a mix of arduous tasks and distant gazes. But everything changed when she crossed paths with her employer, a powerful and charismatic man whose attention was like a spark in her already weary heart. His words were gentle, promises wrapped in charm, and Abigail succumbed to passion. Their love seemed like the only genuine thing in a world full of falsehoods. Between secret encounters and declarations of affection, she believed she had finally found her destiny. However, the glow of their relationship didn't last long. What began as moments of pure ecstasy and an almost magical connection soon turned into a cycle of pain. Abigail gave herself entirely, believing their love was eternal. Promises of a future together, far from the shadows of the mansion, fueled her hopes and strengthened her desire to build a life by his side. Yet there was always something just out of reach, an invisible barrier preventing her from fully living that love. Like all illusions, the passion began to show its cracks. Still dreaming, she ignored the signs that she might be the only one truly committed. One day, her life changed again, but in an unexpected way. Abigail discovered she was pregnant. At first, she thought the news would mark a new phase in their relationship. After all, wouldn't a child be the bond to unite them forever? With her heart racing, she decided to tell her employer, hoping he would embrace her and reaffirm his promises of eternal love. Instead, she was met with a coldness that cut deep. The man who once enveloped her with tenderness now looked at her with disdain, as though she were a problem to be solved, no longer the passionate lover he once adored. The rejection was brutal. In an instant, all the dreams Abigail had nurtured came crashing down. With no trace of affection left, she was cast out of the mansion, dismissed as if she were to blame for believing in that love. Feeling betrayed and lost, she wandered the streets aimlessly, with no place to call home. The city, once brimming with opportunities, now suffocated her with its towering walls of concrete, and the harsh winter mirrored the emptiness growing inside her. Abigail, now pregnant and alone, had no idea how she would survive what lay ahead. The days grew darker, and Abigail, weak and disoriented, felt the weight of loneliness with every step she took through the streets of New York. Her weary body struggled to keep moving, but her mind could no longer envision a future. Around every corner, she searched for shelter, but all she found were closed doors and indifferent stares. The pain of abandonment and betrayal was unbearable, and the fear for her child's life only grew stronger. With nowhere to turn, Abigail faced what seemed to be an endless road, her only solace the quiet love she felt for the life growing inside her. When Abigail was expelled from the mansion, her life took a turn she could never have imagined. Once believing she was living a love story, she now found herself abandoned, with a child on the way and no one to turn to. The pain of rejection was a heavy burden, and the feeling of betrayal mingled with despair. As her belly began to swell, every step through the streets of New York felt like a losing battle. There was nowhere to go, no one to extend a helping hand. The world, once full of promise, had become a maze of loneliness and cold. The nights were the worst. Abigail wandered aimlessly, seeking refuge wherever she could, but every corner brought only more solitude. The darkness of the streets reflected the chaos in her mind, and the biting cold reminded her she was utterly alone. Her strength dwindled with each passing day, and the pregnancy felt like more than her body could bear. Abigail, who had once dreamed of a future with the man she loved, was now living a nightmare with no sign of relief. Her heart, once filled with passion, was now enveloped in profound sadness. On the rare occasions she found a place to rest, the discomfort was overwhelming. With no resources, Abigail was forced to sleep on park benches or the cold floors of abandoned buildings. The bustling city, which never slept, seemed indifferent to her suffering. People passed her by as if she were invisible, as if her pain held no significance. Amid it all, the baby in her womb was the only thing giving her the strength to carry on. A mother's love, even in the midst of chaos, was what kept her going, though her body and mind were utterly exhausted. Each day was a new battle for survival. Hunger began to gnaw at her, and Abigail grew weaker, lacking the energy to seek help. The promises of eternal love had dissipated into thin air, leaving behind bitter memories of the man who had abandoned her. Around every corner, her fear of the future grew. She knew her child needed more than she could offer, but she didn't know how to escape her situation. Each step on the icy streets felt like a march toward darkness, as her dreams of happiness slipped away like the wind. On one of those days of pure despair, Abigail's body began to fail. The pains of pregnancy intensified, and she collapsed to her knees on a bustling street corner, completely vulnerable. People passed her by, some glanced with curiosity, others with indifference, but no one stopped to help. The world seemed to have turned its back on her, and the city, once full of promise, now felt like an inescapable prison. Abigail, utterly drained, crumpled right there, her fate left to chance. Fortunately, at that moment, a social worker happened to pass by and noticed her. Moved by compassion, the woman approached and recognized the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, she called an ambulance, and within minutes, Abigail was rushed to the nearest hospital. The fight for life wasn't just hers anymore, but also for the two lives growing inside her womb. Yes, two. To Abigail's surprise, she was carrying twins. The race against time had begun, and hope, however faint, still flickered. At the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. The doctors quickly realized Abigail's condition was critical. Her body, weakened by months of malnutrition and abandonment on the streets, could no longer bear the burden of carrying two lives. Nurses scurried around, preparing for an emergency delivery. Meanwhile, Abigail, barely conscious, fought to stay awake. The only thought keeping her grounded was the desire to see her child, even if only for a fleeting moment. The pain was immense, but the love she felt for the unborn child was even greater. The delivery was swift, and despite all the complications, two baby girls entered the world healthy and crying, a huge surprise for Abigail, who had no idea she was carrying twins, let alone two daughters. Identical and flawless, they seemed like exact copies of one another. For a brief moment, Abigail felt a wave of relief as she heard her daughter's cries. However, her body could no longer endure. Each breath was a struggle, and her strength was slipping away. The nurses placed the newborns in her arms, and for a fleeting moment, Abigail felt the warmth of her daughters. Deep down, she knew she wouldn't live to see them grow. Her tired eyes sought one last look at her daughters' tiny faces before closing forever. Abigail took her final breath, comforted by the knowledge that, at the very least, her daughters were alive and had a chance she never had. The delivery room fell silent, a solemn moment to honor the life that had ended and the two that had just begun. The nurses, moved by Abigail's tragic story, looked at the babies with a mix of sadness and hope. The twin girls were now alone in the world, motherless but surrounded by the fragile possibility of a new future. At that moment, their destinies were uncertain, but their lives were already marked by the pain of an irreplaceable loss. Shortly after Abigail's passing, the authorities were notified. With no one to care for them, the twins were placed into the adoption system. The hospital, which had only hours earlier witnessed the miracle of life, now became the stage for a bitter farewell. Abigail had departed without knowing what the future held for her daughters, but the love she had poured into their brief moments together would live on. The twin girls, so small and fragile, were about to embark on a journey filled with more surprises than anyone could have imagined. The twins, orphaned from the very beginning, were quickly integrated into the adoption system. News of two identical, healthy baby girls spread quickly among adoption agencies, and soon families expressed interest. Fate, which had been so cruel to their mother, took a new turn by separating the two sisters and carving out completely different paths for each. Rose was adopted by the Wallmarks, a wealthy family, while Ruth was taken in by the Browns, a lower-middle-class household. Though identical in appearance, their lives would diverge dramatically from that moment forward. Rose's arrival at the Wallmark mansion was met with great celebration. Luna and Henry, her new parents, were a young, affluent couple who had chosen not to have biological children. The moment they saw Rose, they were captivated by her sweetness and beauty. To them, the little girl was the perfect addition to their luxurious yet emotionally hollow lives. From her earliest days, Rose was treated like a princess. Expensive clothes, extravagant toys, and every possible comfort were at her disposal. However, as time went on, she would learn that despite all the luxury, true love doesn't always come wrapped in expensive gifts. Ruth, on the other hand, was welcomed with the same love but into a much humbler home. Peter and Ava Brown were a modest couple with generous hearts. Hardworking and devoted to family, they already had 2 children, Leanne and Emma, who were thrilled to have a new sister. Ruth grew up surrounded by genuine affection, learning early on to appreciate life's simple joys. The Browns couldn't provide the opulence of the Wallmarks, but their home was filled with something money couldn't buy: constant love, support, and a sense of unity. Every family member played an active role in raising Ruth, who grew up valuing hard work and honesty. While Rose adapted to a life of indulgence and extravagance, Ruth experienced the world through simplicity and affection. The two sisters, though identical in appearance, were living opposite realities. Rose had no idea that despite all the gifts, something essential was missing: her parents' presence. Always busy, Luna and Henry's prolonged absences left Rose growing up lonely, even amidst her wealth. Ruth, on the other hand, lacked fancy clothes and expensive toys but was never deprived of what truly mattered: love, quality time, and a profound sense of belonging. As time passed, the distance between the two sisters grew, not only physically but emotionally and in life experiences. While Rose learned to navigate a world of privilege, Ruth was raised to value effort and responsibility, helping with small chores and actively participating in family life. Neither had any idea of the other's existence. Separated at birth, the twins were living in completely different worlds, unaware that their lives were destined to intersect again in an unexpected way. Rose's life with the Wallmarks seemed like a true fairy tale to those looking from the outside. Born under dramatic circumstances and adopted by a prestigious family, she was named Rose, a name chosen by her adoptive mother, Luna, to reflect the delicacy and beauty they saw in her. Each new day brought Rose an array of gifts, fine clothes, and everything money could buy. The mansion where she lived was immense, full of luxury and opulence, yet cold and lonely. What the Wallmarks failed to realize was that, no matter how much they tried to compensate with material things, what Rose truly needed was love, a commodity that was sadly always in short supply. Ruth, on the other hand, grew up far from glamour but surrounded by something much more valuable: a family that loved her unconditionally. Adopted by the Browns, she was given the name Ruth, a simple yet strong name symbolizing the family's faith and dedication. Peter and Ava, her adoptive parents, raised Ruth with both affection and discipline, teaching her values like honesty, perseverance, and hard work from an early age. The Browns lived in a middle-class neighborhood, far removed from the splendor of the wealthy, but their home was filled with laughter, conversations around the table, and a deep sense of belonging that Ruth would come to cherish profoundly. The two families, so different in their lifestyles, were separated by far more than geographical distance. Rose and Ruth grew up completely unaware of each other's existence, living polar opposite realities. Rose, isolated in her tower of wealth, often looked at the world with disdain, unable to grasp the true value of things. To her, work was a distant and unnecessary concept since everything had always been handed to her. Ruth, on the other hand, grew up knowing that nothing in life came easy. She helped out at home, completed her chores, and dreamed of carving out her place in the world through her own efforts. The Wallmarks and the Browns, though distant, were equally devoted to their adoptive daughters, each in their own way. Luna and Henry Wallmark showered Rose with expensive gifts, as if they could buy her happiness, while Peter and Ava Brown gave Ruth something money could never buy: time, attention, and love. This subtle yet essential difference in upbringing would shape who the girls would become in the future. While Rose was molded by superficiality and excess, Ruth was being strengthened by simplicity and effort, two paths that would profoundly impact their lives. As the years passed, the distance between Rose and Ruth became even more pronounced. They lived in worlds that seemed unlikely to ever intersect. Rose attended the best private schools, where discipline was lax and privileges abounded. Ruth, in contrast, attended public schools, where she learned to fight for every achievement, always supported by the unwavering encouragement of the Brown family. Though they were hundreds of miles apart, the sisters' paths were destined to cross again one day. Fate, which had already dealt them a harsh blow, was preparing something even more surprising. Luna and Henry Wallmark were a young, highly successful couple in their respective careers. From the beginning of their marriage, they had made a clear choice. They didn't want biological children. The idea of going through pregnancy and the challenges of raising a baby didn't align with their plans. They were more focused on maintaining their careers and active social lives. However, after a few years of marriage, they began to feel their home was becoming too empty. That's when they decided to adopt. Bringing Rose into their lives seemed like the perfect solution to fill the void without compromising their cherished lifestyle. When Rose joined the Wallmark family, she was welcomed like a true princess. The couple went to great lengths to give her the very best. Luna took personal charge of selecting the most elegant clothes for the girl, while Henry ensured she lacked nothing material. As an only child, all the attention the Wallmarks were willing to give to a child was focused on her. However, this attention didn't translate to quality time. The Wallmarks were always busy with social or business commitments, leaving Rose, despite her luxurious surroundings, to grow up without her parents' consistent presence. Rose's indulgences were countless. From her earliest days, she had access to the most expensive toys, sophisticated clothing, and exclusive experiences. Extravagant birthday parties, exotic vacations, and a life of opulence were her everyday reality. Yet, for all the gifts she received, something essential was missing: genuine affection and dedicated time. The Wallmarks believed they were doing everything right by providing Rose with a life of comfort, but it became increasingly clear that the emotional void she felt couldn't be filled with material things. Despite the wealth surrounding her, Rose grew up lonely. The mansion was enormous, filled with echoing silences and empty hallways that amplified her sense of isolation. Luna and Henry, though financially generous adoptive parents, remained emotionally distant. They didn't engage in the simple joys, like playing in the garden or sharing a family dinner, leaving these moments to the care of household staff. Rose, meanwhile, grew accustomed to being surrounded by expensive objects but devoid of her parents' genuine affection. This emotional emptiness began to shape her personality. As she grew older, Rose became more demanding, used to always getting her way. The Wallmarks imposed few limits, and she had no concept of responsibility. Even so, amid all the luxury, something always seemed to be missing. She watched other children with their families, sharing laughter and simple moments, and deep down, she felt there was something more she wasn't experiencing. What Rose didn't know was that fate, unpredictable as ever, still had many surprises in store, ones that would make her question everything she had learned up to that point. Ruth, in contrast to Rose, wasn't welcomed with luxuries but with something far more valuable: a home filled with love and faith. Peter and Ava Brown were a dedicated Christian family who lived simply yet lacked none of the essentials. Peter worked hard at a textile factory, earning a modest but steady income to support his household. Though not wealthy, the Browns were always willing to share what they had, especially the love they felt for one another. Ruth's arrival was a blessing, and the couple, along with their children, Leanne and Emma, couldn't have been more thrilled to welcome a new member into their family. Leanne and Emma, Peter and Ava's older children, quickly grew attached to Ruth. From the very beginning, they treated her as if she had always been a part of their family. Leanne, the eldest, with his protective nature, saw himself as the responsible older brother who would help care for the little girl. Emma, with her generous heart and endless curiosity, became Ruth's best friend, sharing toys, laughter, and the small daily adventures that filled life in the Browns' home. Ruth couldn't have asked for better siblings, and though she remained unaware of her twin sister's existence, she felt completely embraced by her new family. Life in the Browns' household was guided by simple yet solid values. Ruth grew up surrounded by examples of hard work, honesty, and faith. Peter, a man of few words but firm actions, believed that work was the foundation of a dignified life. He taught his children that effort would always be rewarded and that, with faith in God and persistence, any obstacle could be overcome. Ava, on the other hand, was the heart of the home. With her nurturing spirit, she was always ready to listen, teach, and guide her children toward goodness. For Ruth, this new life, while modest, was filled with warmth and security. The daily routine in the Browns' home was humble yet rich in affection. Mornings began early, with Peter heading off to work while Ava managed the household and cared for the children. Sundays were reserved for church, a sacred family tradition. For Ruth, these moments of unity in prayer were special, and she grew increasingly connected to the teachings of her adoptive parents. Faith was a constant presence in their home, whether in conversations around the dinner table or the small moral lessons Peter and Ava made sure to impart. Ruth was building a solid foundation of love and spirituality, qualities that would shape her inner strength throughout her life. While Rose lived surrounded by luxury and indulgence but devoid of affection, Ruth was raised with the most valuable treasures, a loving and present family. Leanne and Emma became Ruth's best friends and partners in all her childhood adventures, and each passing day made her feel more integrated and cherished. Ruth's future seemed bright, not because of material wealth, but because of the treasure trove of values and love the Brown family gave her. Little did Ruth know, however, that destiny still had twists and challenges in store that would test everything she had learned in this simple, yet deeply loving home. Rose, meanwhile, grew up amidst luxury, surrounded by everything money could buy, yet missing out on life's true riches, love and shared time. Luna and Henry, though materially generous adoptive parents, were always busy with their own commitments. As a result, Rose spent much of her time alone in the vast mansion. Ironically, despite the wealth surrounding her, she felt empty inside. Her parents were physically present but emotionally distant, leading Rose to bond with the only person who truly paid attention to her, Emma, the maid, who essentially became the mother figure Luna could never be. Rose's relationship with her parents was formal and often superficial. Luna, always preoccupied with her social life and business ventures, had little time for meaningful conversations with her daughter. Henry, though affectionate when present, was increasingly consumed by work, making his visits to the mansion infrequent. The emotional distance between them grew with each passing day, and Rose learned to live surrounded by gifts and indulgences, but without the genuine love she so deeply desired. The luxuries filled her hands, but never the void in her heart. Emma, the mansion's maid, became the true maternal figure in Rose's life. Since Rose was little, Emma dressed her, fed her, and told her bedtime stories. It was Emma who taught Rose life's little lessons, from tying her shoes to understanding the importance of kindness, a value that ironically clashed with the way Rose began to treat people around her. Despite Emma's care and devotion, her parents' constant absence left deep scars on Rose. She grew up without boundaries, accustomed to getting her way but without understanding the true value of things. Spoiled by material goods and a life of excess, Rose lacked the social and emotional skills that other children her age naturally developed. The lack of boundaries and her parents' absence turned her into a child who, from a young age, used her privileged position to manipulate and get what she wanted. When things didn't go her way, she became irritable and took it out on the few people around her, including Emma, who patiently endured Rose's whims. Over time, Rose learned to rely only on herself and her status, believing the world revolved around her desires. Beneath the sparkle and ostentation of her lifestyle, Rose felt immense loneliness. Her luxurious dolls and expensive clothes couldn't replace the affection she craved from her parents. Emma did what she could, but it was never the same. Rose grew up feeling incomplete, unable to identify exactly what was missing. Over time, this silent loneliness would shape the young woman she would become, someone who, behind a facade of perfection, carried immense pain and emptiness in her heart, waiting, perhaps, for something or someone to fill the void. Rose's childhood was marked by an abundance of gifts but a scarcity of affection. Her parents, Luna and Henry, seemed to believe they could make up for their absences with the most expensive toys and luxurious clothes. Every birthday and holiday brought enormous boxes filled with imported dolls, miniature dollhouse furniture, or designer dresses Rose barely had time to wear before outgrowing them. But no matter how extravagant her bedroom was, a true child's paradise filled with the best money could buy, it was also the place where she spent most of her time alone, waiting for parents who never had time for her. Luna and Henry's schedules were always packed with business commitments. If they weren't traveling for work, they were attending endless meetings or high society events to maintain the family's elevated status. Despite being treated like a princess materially, Rose grew up not knowing the love of an unexpected hug or the joy of playing in the garden with her parents. Nights when Henry came home late and Luna didn't return at all were common. Rose's only company, apart from her luxurious toys, was Emma, who did her best to fill the emotional void that consumed the little girl. The expensive clothes and lavish gifts, while impressive to outsiders, could never replace the absence of Rose's parents. She was given the finest dresses, tailored just for her, and every time Luna returned from a trip, she brought the latest trends in children's fashion. Rose always had the most elegant outfits to wear, but what she truly longed for was something money couldn't buy: her parents' time and attention. Often, the new gifts were left untouched, as Rose knew that behind every beautifully wrapped package was the emptiness left by their absence. For days on end, Rose would barely see her parents. The mansion was massive, and it often felt like they lived in entirely different worlds within the same house. Henry, on the rare occasions he had a moment to spare, would appear only to briefly ask if everything was okay before returning to his responsibilities. Luna, with her packed schedule, would pop in for quick interactions, always in a rush, before disappearing again into meetings. For a child, this emotional absence was devastating. Rose grew up without experiencing simple moments like watching a movie with her parents or laughing over a silly story at the dinner table. Despite the material wealth that surrounded her, the void Rose felt ran deep. Love wasn't in the beautiful clothes or porcelain dolls. It was in the moments that never happened. The lonely nights, waiting to hear her parents' footsteps in the hallway only for them never to come, shaped her in subtle but permanent ways. She began to retreat into her own world, believing that material possessions were the only way to form a connection, as human presence seemed unattainable. And so, without realizing it, Rose was becoming a young woman who didn't truly understand what it meant to be loved. While Rose grew up surrounded by material goods, but with an empty heart, Ruth's life was marked by a completely different kind of wealth. From the moment she arrived at the Browns' home, she was enveloped in genuine, unconditional love. Peter and Ava, her adoptive parents, made a point of celebrating every little milestone in Ruth's life as if it were a grand event. Her first word, her first step, her first smile, Everything was a reason for joy and celebration in the family. Ruth grew up knowing she was deeply loved, and this certainty gave her an inner strength that nothing could shake. Family celebrations at the Browns' home were simple yet meaningful. Ava baked homemade cakes, while Peter brought flowers from the local market to decorate the table. Leanne and Emma, her older siblings, always made sure Ruth was included in their games, and despite the age gap, they treated her with endless patience and affection. They taught her to dance, sing the songs they learned at school, and every Sunday the whole family attended church. For Ruth, these moments were sacred, not only for the faith she was learning to nurture, but for the sense of unity that only a loving family can provide. The love Ruth received from her siblings was also a vital part of her childhood. Leanne, as the eldest, saw himself as her protector, always attentive to her needs and eager to teach her everything he knew. Emma, with her cheerful spirit, made it a point to include Ruth in all her activities, from backyard games to afternoons spent drawing and reading. The bond between them was strong, and Ruth knew that no matter what happened, she could always count on her siblings' unconditional support. They taught her that even in life's smallest moments, joy could be found, and that true wealth came from shared love. On Sundays, attending church was an important ritual for the Browns. Ruth loved those moments. To her, the sound of hymns, Bible stories, and the sense of community were profoundly meaningful. Peter and Ava were diligent in teaching Ruth the importance of faith, gratitude, and forgiveness. These values would become fundamental in shaping Ruth's character, allowing her to grow into a young woman who understood that true strength didn't come from money or status, but from love, faith, and perseverance in doing what was right, even in the face of hardship. Every stage of Ruth's life was closely followed by her parents and siblings, who were always ready to celebrate her achievements and support her through difficulties. The loving yet disciplined environment of the Browns' household allowed Ruth to grow up confident, compassionate, and, above all, grateful for the life she had. Though her reality was vastly different from her twin sisters, Ruth was becoming a strong, determined young woman, ready to face any challenge the future might hold. And unbeknownst to her, destiny was already preparing her next great trial. From an early age, Rose was accustomed to a life where everything was handed to her. Any desire she expressed was quickly fulfilled, and she never had to face the word no. The boundaries typically set for children to help them develop discipline and responsibility were absent in Rose's reality. As a result, she became a young woman who didn't know how to manage her own affairs, relying entirely on others to handle everything for her. From clothes meticulously arranged in her wardrobe to meals prepared by professional chefs, Rose never had to lift a finger to take care of herself. This life of excess extended to her education as well. Rose attended the most prestigious schools, where the standard of learning was high but personal effort was often bypassed by her parents' influence and wealth. Although she had access to the best educational opportunities, she rarely put in the effort. For Rose, life had always delivered everything on a silver platter, and the concept of hard work or dedication was foreign to her. Over time, this affected her ability to handle challenges. At the first sign of difficulty, her instinct was to seek an easy way out, never taking responsibility herself. At the elite schools she attended, Rose was a well-known figure but not necessarily well-liked. She struggled to maintain lasting friendships, partly because she had never learned how to deal with conflicts or differences. Accustomed to being the center of attention at home, she expected the same treatment from her peers, but the reality of school life was different. When things didn't go her way, Rose withdrew. As a result, she had few true friends over the years. Most of the people who gravitated toward her were more interested in her social status than in who she truly was. Rose's isolation deepened over time. Although she attended parties and social events with her schoolmates, she felt alone in the crowd. Her inability to form deep and meaningful connections made her even more vulnerable. Deep down, Rose knew the superficial friendships she maintained weren't genuine, but her pride and belief that money could solve anything kept her from seeking authentic relationships. Slowly, she grew accustomed to solitude, masking it with more shopping and more parties, an endless pursuit to fill the void. The lack of boundaries and responsibilities in her childhood profoundly shaped Rose. She grew up without the ability to face life's challenges in a healthy way. Instead of addressing issues maturely, her tendency was to blame others and avoid confrontation. What she failed to realize was that this attitude was pushing away the very people who might have offered her genuine support. Her world, though surrounded by luxury and privilege, grew increasingly lonely, and fate was already setting the stage for her to face, for the first time, the consequences of her own actions. From an early age, Ruth was taught to value every small task assigned to her. Peter and Ava Brown firmly believed that discipline and responsibility were essential for a child's development. And so Ruth grew up in an environment where love and affection went hand in hand with firm guidance. Each day, Ruth helped tidy her room, putting away her toys and organizing her belongings. To her, these tasks weren't a burden but a way to contribute to the harmony of the household, making her feel part of something bigger. Every time her parents praised her for a job well done, Ruth felt even more motivated to keep helping. Ruth's small responsibilities didn't stop there. Gradually, she began participating in the family's daily activities. On Sundays, she helped her mother set the table for family lunches, carefully arranging plates, cutlery, and napkins. Ava always made sure to compliment her dedication, and Peter, with his proud smile, showed his daughter that effort was worthwhile. Ruth learned early on that life was made up of small contributions and that teamwork was what kept the household running smoothly. These simple yet profound lessons shaped Ruth's worldview and prepared her to face life's challenges. Education was also a priority for the Browns. Peter and Ava, though not as financially well off as they would have liked, did everything they could to ensure Ruth and her siblings received a good education. Ruth attended quality schools within the family's means, and she knew that every notebook and school uniform symbolized her parents' sacrifices and dedication to providing the best possible future for their children. Ruth, in turn, never took these opportunities for granted. She worked hard in school, knowing that education was her key to a brighter future. Living in an environment of love and discipline shaped Ruth in a unique way. She grew up understanding the value of things, not by their price but by the effort behind them. Every toy she put away, every chore she completed represented a valuable lesson in responsibility and care. Unlike her sister Rose, who always had everything done for her, Ruth knew that life required dedication and perseverance. She didn't just complete her tasks out of obligation, but because she understood the positive impact they had on her family. This made her increasingly strong and confident. The combination of affection and discipline forged Ruth into a resilient individual. Even at a young age, she understood that she had the power to shape her own life based on the values her parents had instilled in her. The love she received was the foundation of her security, while the discipline she learned daily prepared her to face the world. Although her life was simple, she recognized that this simplicity was, in fact, the source of her strength. Ruth grew up knowing that with honesty, hard work, and love, she could overcome any challenge life threw her way. Ruth's social life was built on the affection and genuine connections she maintained with those around her. At home, Leanne and Emma were her closest friends, the first people she turned to in times of joy or sadness. Together, they formed an inseparable trio, always ready to support one another. Ruth knew she could count on them for anything, and this unwavering support fostered a profound sense of belonging. Outside the home, Ruth also formed strong bonds with her school friends. Even amid the small arguments and disagreements that arose, she learned valuable lessons about the importance of friendship and resolving conflicts. At school, Ruth had a close-knit circle of friends with whom she shared the ups and downs of daily life. Despite their different personalities, there was a special connection among them. Like any group of friends, they occasionally fought, but these disagreements never lasted long. Ruth, always calm and thoughtful, understood that conflicts were opportunities to strengthen relationships rather than break them. Her parents encouraged her to solve her own problems, and over time, Ruth developed emotional maturity that allowed her to approach conflicts with wisdom and empathy, always seeking understanding rather than harboring resentment. The disagreements Ruth had with her friends were typical of any group of children. Sometimes a misunderstood word or thoughtless gesture led to arguments, but they always reconciled quickly. Ruth knew that maintaining a friendship required effort and understanding. The lessons she learned at home about the importance of dialogue and patience were applied in her interactions with her friends. Gradually, she realized that, while conflicts were inevitable, they could be overcome with goodwill and a willingness to listen to others. This understanding helped her grow emotionally in a significant way. In addition to her friends, Ruth was fortunate to have her siblings as constant sources of support. Leanne and Emma, being older, often helped her navigate conflicts and offered valuable advice. With them, Ruth could share her feelings and reflect on the best ways to resolve disputes at school. The family's unity became an important pillar in how Ruth approached the world around her. She knew that with her family's support and her own ability to solve problems, she could overcome any obstacle, whether in her friendships or in the challenges life presented. As Ruth grew older, she realized that her ability to solve problems on her own made her more confident and independent. While other children often relied on adults to mediate their conflicts, Ruth developed a more mature approach, always striving to find fair solutions to the challenges she faced. Life, with all its complexities, was already beginning to show her that not everything would be easy. But armed with her inner strength and the lessons she had learned from her parents, Ruth was more than ready to face these challenges head-on. And though she didn't know it yet, this skill of overcoming conflicts would prove essential for the challenges yet to come. Rose's childhood, on the other hand, was marked by a kind of distant, almost mechanical love. While her parents, Luna and Henry, had the intention of providing for her as best they could, their way of showing affection was limited to material gestures. Rose always had the best clothes, luxurious toys, and a privileged life, but there were no warm hugs or heartfelt conversations to build an emotional connection. The loneliness that surrounded her in the mansion caused her to grow up without developing genuine affection for those around her. Everything in her life felt distant and formal, shaping her worldview in a narrow and superficial way. Without parents who encouraged her to face challenges or pursue her own goals, Rose grew up without learning how to fight for her desires. For her, everything was simply handed over without effort or sacrifice. She never dreamed big, never envisioned herself striving for something greater. Every small whim was immediately fulfilled, and as a result, Rose never felt the need to work for anything. The absence of challenges in her childhood turned her into someone who expected the world to cater to her wishes. When it didn't, her first reaction was always frustration and blaming others. The lack of experiences that could have taught her how to deal with problems and overcome obstacles made Rose a person with little resilience. She didn't know how to handle difficulties, let alone solve them. When things didn't go as expected, her immediate response was to blame others, never herself. Criticizing and bossing around those around her became ingrained in her personality, fueled by the belief that she was always right and that the world existed to serve her. This behavior not only emotionally distanced her from others, but also limited her own personal growth. Rose never developed the habit of exploring her potential. She was a young woman with countless opportunities at her disposal, but lacked the guidance or encouragement needed to discover her own abilities. Her frustrations with the world around her only grew over time, as she found herself unable to handle situations that required effort or responsibility. Her response to any problem was always the same: blaming others. If something didn't meet her expectations, it was because someone had failed her. Rose never learned the value of solving her own issues or taking responsibility for her actions. Though surrounded by privileges, Rose's life was an emotional prison. She lived in isolation, unable to recognize the greatness she could achieve if only she tried. She wasn't a fighter. She didn't know what it meant to work toward a goal or achieve something through her own merits. Her worldview was narrow, dominated by immediacy, with no room for growth or self-improvement. And though she didn't realize it, her inability to deal with life's challenges was about to catch up with her in a way she could never have imagined. Ruth, on the other hand, had built an inner strength from a young age that allowed her to face adversity with courage. Unlike her sister, who always had everything handed to her, Ruth understood that life was a journey full of challenges and that success came to those willing to fight for it. Every small accomplishment in the Browns' household was the result of effort and dedication, and through this, Ruth developed the identity of a warrior. She knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, there was always a solution if she was willing to persist. With this mindset, she grew up confident and unafraid to face whatever lay ahead. Ruth's kindness and compassion were traits that made everyone around her feel welcome. No matter how tough the situation, she was always ready to help, offering a smile or a comforting word. This caring and nurturing nature didn't come by chance. It was the result of the loving environment in which she was raised, where empathy and care for others were values instilled from an early age. Ruth firmly believed that every person had the potential to do good, and she sought to be that source of light for those struggling with difficulties in their lives. Faith in God was another fundamental pillar of Ruth's life. From a young age, she accompanied her family to church and grew up listening to stories of resilience and faith. This spiritual connection kept her grounded in many difficult moments, and she knew that, no matter how unpredictable life was, God would always be by her side, guiding her steps. Ruth didn't see faith as something distant, but as a constant presence that strengthened her and gave her hope, even in the darkest times. This trust in something greater helped her maintain a light heart and a focused mind as she pursued her goals. Everything Ruth had learned from her parents became an inexhaustible source of strength and wisdom. Peter and Ava had taught her the value of hard work, honesty, and kindness, and these lessons shaped her worldview. Ruth knew she had immense potential and that she could overcome any obstacle as long as she remained true to the values she had been taught. She didn't need material wealth or ease. What motivated her was the belief that, through effort and dedication, she could achieve her dreams and help others along the way. This resilient spirit set her apart from many and prepared her for whatever challenges life might bring. Ruth was a young woman who believed in her own power to transform her life. With every new challenge, she faced the world with optimism and a willingness to learn, even in the most difficult situations. This warrior identity, forged from her childhood, made her stand out for her perseverance and ability to overcome obstacles. While others might give up in the face of adversity, Ruth saw challenges as opportunities for growth and learning. And unbeknownst to her, this inner strength would prove crucial for the trials that awaited her in the future. The day that had started as a joyful and ordinary one for Ruth quickly turned into her worst nightmare. The Brown family had planned a trip, a break from their routine to enjoy some rest and quality time together. As always, the air was filled with happiness, and Ruth was excited for another outing with the people she loved most. They were her fortress, her foundation, and she could never imagine life without their constant presence. But in a matter of seconds, fate intervened. A devastating car accident abruptly ended what should have been just another happy day. The impact was catastrophic. Dazed and disoriented, Ruth woke up amidst the wreckage, surrounded by a chilling silence that signaled an unbearable loss. She was alive, but everyone else, her beloved family, was gone. The reality of the tragedy was suffocating, and the slow, cruel realization that she was the sole survivor began to take hold. The void Ruth felt as she understood she would never again see her father's smile, feel her mother's comforting touch, or hear her siblings' laughter was immeasurable. The world, once filled with love and security, now felt cold and meaningless. Now alone in the world, Ruth struggled to comprehend what had happened. At the hospital, while her body began to recover from the physical injuries, her soul bore wounds that seemed impossible to heal. Memories of her family flooded her mind, each one a bittersweet reminder of what she had lost. She recalled her father's lessons on facing life's challenges, her mother's warm embrace, and the playful moments with her siblings. What once brought her joy now became painful reminders of the love and happiness that had been taken from her. Condolences poured in from every direction, but no words of comfort could ease the growing emptiness inside her. Ruth found herself surrounded by unfamiliar faces, people who tried to help but could never fill the void left by her family. The pain of her loss was overwhelming, and the grief was all-consuming. Yet, even in the depths of despair, the strength her parents had nurtured in her over the years remained. Deep down, Ruth knew she would need to find a way to move forward, even if she didn't yet know how. Though the tragedy was devastating, it couldn't erase the inner strength Ruth had developed throughout her life. Amid the darkness, she began to realize that her family was still with her, in a different way. They had left her not only with cherished memories, but also with teachings and a legacy of love that would never fade. Even as she felt lost and shattered by grief, Ruth knew she had to honor what they had given her. The ability to face challenges, the strength to rebuild, and the love she would carry in her heart forever. After the tragic accident, Ruth found herself facing a new reality she had never imagined. Her life, once surrounded by the love and security of her family, now felt like an unfamiliar and desolate terrain. She had no one left to turn to, and the weight of complete solitude was crushing. Ruth hadn't yet started college and, without a profession, had no idea how to begin forging her own path. All she had was the modest life insurance her parents had left behind, but Ruth quickly realized that the money wouldn't be enough to support her for long. The grief and uncertainty about her future weighed heavily on Ruth's shoulders, but she knew she needed to make quick decisions. The life insurance provided a small financial reprieve, but wasn't enough to allow her to live comfortably and continue her education without worries. Ruth had always dreamed of pursuing a career and building something meaningful, but now, without her family's support, achieving her goals seemed further and more challenging than ever. Yet, the lessons of perseverance her parents had instilled in her began to echo within. She knew that, no matter how difficult it was, she had to find a way to move forward. Deciding her next steps wasn't easy. Ruth understood she would need to work to support herself while continuing her studies. The weight of this responsibility felt overwhelming, but her determination was stronger. The thought of balancing a job and school frightened her. She had never faced such a daunting situation before, but she knew it was the only path forward. Life wouldn't hand her anything anymore, and it was now up to her to build the future she had always envisioned. Her family had given her the strength to fight, and Ruth was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. What motivated Ruth most was her desire to honor her parents' legacy. She didn't want the tragedy to define her or prevent her from achieving her dreams. On the contrary, she wanted to prove to the world and herself that she could rise above the hardship and keep moving forward. Ruth knew she had to be strategic with the little money she had, saving as much as possible to cover her basic expenses while searching for a job to sustain herself and continue her education. Every decision was meticulously planned because now every penny mattered. Even in the face of such adversity, Ruth found within herself a strength she had never needed before. She knew the journey would be long and arduous, but giving up wasn't an option. The path to her dreams was now different from what she had envisioned, but with persistence and hard work, Ruth was determined to find a way to achieve her goals, no matter how difficult the challenges ahead might be. She was ready to face the future with the same courage and resilience her parents had instilled in her since she was a child. While Ruth faced the struggles of building her future with determination, Rose walked a completely different path. From her teenage years, Rose had shown little interest in pursuing academics or building a career. The idea of going to college or working toward a goal had never appealed to her. Rebellious and dissatisfied with her parents' expectations, Rose preferred to dedicate her time to parties and a luxurious social life. Her rebellious attitude further distanced her from her parents, who, preoccupied with their business endeavors, didn't know how to handle a daughter whose priorities were so starkly different from their own. Rose was the center of attention at any social event. Her wealth and status secured her a circle of friends who, although always surrounding her, valued her more for what she could offer than for who she truly was. The boys, captivated by her lifestyle, saw Rose as the popular girl who always footed the bill for parties and dinners, and she loved it. Rose felt powerful being the focal point, effortlessly paying the tabs and impressing everyone with her luxury car. But deep down, the life she led was shallow, built on appearances and relationships that lacked authenticity. With every new gathering, Rose reinforced her self-destructive behavior. She adored the glitz and glamour of her lifestyle, but failed to see that she was surrounded by people who didn't genuinely care for her. The boys she dated were more interested in her fortune than in her personality. Rose had become a sort of sponsor for the parties, someone everyone wanted around for convenience. While Ruth fought for every achievement, Rose sank deeper into a life of excess and superficiality, oblivious to the long-term consequences her actions would bring. The emotional void Rose had felt since childhood was still present, but now she masked it with parties, shopping sprees, and late-night outings. The more she felt alone, the more she sought events and company to try to fill the emptiness. Yet, nothing seemed enough. Even surrounded by people, Rose knew they weren't by her side for who she truly was. With every party, every drink, she drifted further away from the person she could have been, a young woman with the potential for greatness, but who had never been encouraged to explore her capabilities. As time passed, Rose remained trapped in this spiral of self-destruction. The idea of building a stable future or striving for something beyond the present was entirely foreign to her. Her parents, though concerned, had no idea how to handle their daughter, who was so immersed in her life of parties that any conversation about responsibilities or future plans was ignored. Rose was on a dangerous path and had no idea that the consequences of her choices would soon come knocking, forcing her to confront reality in ways she had never experienced. Worried about Rose's increasingly erratic behavior, Luna and Henry Wallmark realized they needed to take drastic measures to pull their daughter out of her reckless lifestyle. Their solution was to marry Rose off to a respectable man, someone who could stabilize her and provide the responsibility she had never taken on herself. After lengthy discussions and meetings with friends in high society, they found the ideal suitor, Jimmy. Young, handsome, the owner of several companies, and most importantly, successful, Jimmy seemed like the only person capable of saving Rose from herself. Rose, who had always been surrounded by men interested more in her wealth than in her, saw something different in Jimmy. He was charming, polite, and most importantly, had what she valued most: money and status. The combination of his good looks, charisma, and financial power quickly caught Rose's attention. The idea of marrying a man who could offer her even more luxury and security appealed to her. And for the first time, Rose saw an opportunity to change her life, even if that change was motivated more by convenience than genuine love. Jimmy, on the other hand, saw in Rose an attractive and glamorous woman, someone who could stand by his side at business and social events. He was unaware of the depth of her emotional issues or the chaotic life she led. To Jimmy, Rose was the perfect partner for his image as a successful businessman. Unlike Rose's previous companions, Jimmy wasn't solely interested in the status she brought with her. He genuinely believed they could form a power couple, combining their fortunes and creating an exemplary family. The wedding was quickly arranged, and the Wallmarks spared no expense to ensure everything went as planned. To them, this was the solution to save Rose from her self-destructive behavior, a step toward a more controlled and perhaps even happy life. Rose, motivated by the benefits that marrying Jimmy would bring, also felt a faint hope that her life might finally take a meaningful direction. She was tired of the parties, the shallow friends, and the endless hangovers. Perhaps, with Jimmy by her side, she could find some stability. However, the motivations behind this marriage were far from pure. Rose saw Jimmy as an escape from her empty life but wasn't prepared for the realities of being a wife and taking on responsibilities. While there was an initial attraction, the marriage would only mark the beginning of a new phase filled with challenges. Beneath the appearance of a perfect couple, Rose's unresolved issues were far from over, and her marriage to Jimmy would soon bring to light problems she had never faced before. The early days of Rose and Jimmy's marriage seemed promising. They were a beautiful couple admired by high society, and before long, Rose became pregnant and gave birth to 2 sons, William and Benjamin. Life seemed to be settling into place, and Rose's image as a wife and mother completed the picture Jimmy had always envisioned. However, the reality of this new phase was far different from what Rose had expected. She quickly realized that she had no patience for domestic life or the responsibilities of being a wife and mother. The family routine suffocated her, and what once seemed like a solution to her problems now felt like a burden. Rose was not the type to embrace the role of a devoted homemaker. She felt trapped, as though life with Jimmy and their children had robbed her of her freedom. The weight of maternal responsibilities and her role as a wife deeply irritated her. She longed for the parties, the carefree days, and the endless nights of fun. What had once been a life of indulgence and independence now felt replaced by a routine she despised. This led to explosive behavior from Rose, who began to take out her frustrations on those around her. The first to feel this change were her children. Rose, who should have been present and nurturing, emotionally distanced herself from William and Benjamin. She lacked the patience for their cries or needs, and her temper grew increasingly short. What should have been a loving and supportive environment turned into a household filled with tension and outbursts of anger. The household staff, long accustomed to Rose's whims, now faced her harsh and disrespectful orders. Even Jimmy, who did everything he could to maintain the family's balance, couldn't escape Rose's growing irritation. The marriage Jimmy had envisioned as a stable and loving partnership turned into a significant challenge. He couldn't understand why Rose, who seemingly had everything to be happy, money, healthy children, and a luxurious home, was so dissatisfied. Rose, on the other hand, felt trapped. The perfect life she portrayed to society hid her deep anguish. She was emotionally distant from her children and husband, and each day she withdrew further from her family's reality. The weight of expectations suffocated her, and her aggressive behavior was a desperate attempt to escape the life she had never truly chosen. As time passed, the situation only worsened. Rose began isolating herself even more, and any attempt by Jimmy to connect with her or resolve their conflicts ended in arguments. The tension between them was palpable, turning their home, meant to be a sanctuary, into a battlefield of emotional turmoil. Rose was on the brink of a new phase in her life, one that would bring even more complications as her desire to escape the routine led her to make impulsive and reckless decisions, putting everything at risk. Rose's life after marriage had devolved into a cycle of frivolity and escapism. While Jimmy worked tirelessly to manage his businesses, Rose refused to accompany him to any engagements related to the family's enterprises. She showed no interest in activities that could reinforce her role as Jimmy's partner in life and work. To Rose, the corporate world was dull, a reality she wanted to stay as far from as possible. Instead, she filled her days with superficial pleasures and luxurious routines that kept her far from family responsibilities. Rose spent hours at high-end boutiques, choosing the latest fashion trends while completely ignoring her obligations as a mother. Visits to salons and spas became her frequent escape, places where she could momentarily forget the weight of a domestic life she so resented. She surrounded herself with friends who, like her, enjoyed carefree lives, spending lazy afternoons at country clubs and poolside, far removed from the chaos waiting for her at home. Yet the superficiality of these relationships only reinforced the reality that Rose was running from something much deeper. Over time, Rose began to completely neglect her children. William and Benjamin, still young and needing maternal care and attention, were increasingly left on their own. Rose refused to take on responsibilities like driving them to school, helping with homework, or participating in important moments of their lives. Instead, she delegated all these tasks to Jimmy, the household staff, and the children's nannies. Though she was physically present in the house, her emotional absence was glaring, leaving the children feeling the void of a mother uninterested in their lives. Jimmy, on the other hand, tried to balance his business responsibilities with his role as a father. He took an active part in the children's routines while also attempting to salvage his relationship with Rose. However, her behavior became increasingly difficult to manage. Rose's indifference toward her family and the life they had built together created constant tension in the marriage. Jimmy, still in love with her, desperately tried to reconnect with the woman he had once known, but Rose was slipping further away, sinking deeper into a lifestyle of triviality and detachment. As Rose plunged deeper into her world of excess, she distanced herself from everything that truly mattered. Her relationships with her children, her bond with Jimmy, and even the respect of the household staff were all deteriorating. Rose sought to escape what she saw as a domestic prison, but in doing so, she created a hollow and lonely existence where appearances and luxury were her only companions. She was on the verge of an emotional collapse, and her reckless choices were bound to lead to irreversible consequences. As her marriage with Jimmy became increasingly strained and distant, Rose sought refuge in late-night outings. The family routine frustrated her, and the feeling of being trapped in a role she didn't want pushed her further into a life of parties and clandestine encounters. Along with her friends, Rose began frequenting bars and nightclubs where she could feel free, far from the responsibilities she so despised. In this new world of fun and escapism, she met Nolan, a charismatic and charming real estate agent, with whom she quickly developed a colorful friendship. What began as casual meetups soon evolved into an inevitable affair. With Nolan, Rose felt alive again, free from the expectations of being a wife or mother. Their nights out were filled with adrenaline and excitement, and Rose became attached to the lifestyle he offered. She felt in control, removed from the pressures Jimmy and family life imposed. However, to maintain this double life, Rose began weaving a web of lies. She knew she needed a convincing excuse for her frequent absences, so she fabricated a story about having found a job. Rose told Jimmy she had decided to work at a real estate agency, claiming she could no longer stand being a housewife. To him, this seemed like a sign that she might be trying to rediscover herself and contribute productively to the family. Jimmy believed her lie, unaware that the real reason for her newfound career was Nolan. Using her supposed new job as an excuse, Rose started traveling with her lover, exploring new places and living adventures that made her feel more alive than ever. Weekend getaways and trips became the norm for Rose and Nolan. She used work-related travel as a pretext, all the while indulging in her double life, far from Jimmy and the children's watchful eyes. Rose deluded herself into believing she could maintain this facade without consequences. For her, the sense of freedom and thrill was addictive, making her feel young and desired again. But the deeper she dove into this secret affair, the further she drifted from her family, and the closer she came to the inevitable collapse of her web of lies. Rose's lies were meticulously crafted, ensuring every detail was believable to Jimmy. Busy with work and taking care of their children, he didn't question his wife's absences, thinking she might finally be finding her purpose. But while Jimmy focused on keeping the family afloat, Rose was living a life that had nothing to do with the one they had built together. Her affair with Nolan was an escape, a way to flee reality. With every step she took in that direction, Rose drifted further from the life she had once vowed to share with Jimmy. Meanwhile, Ruth's new life after the tragedy that took her family was anything but easy, but she faced every challenge with the determination that had always defined her. To support herself and continue her studies, she moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was modest but cozy enough to feel like a safe haven. During the day, Ruth attended business school, hoping to build a solid career that would lead to a better future. In the afternoons and evenings, she worked as a waitress at an upscale restaurant, serving elegant dishes to a demanding clientele. Despite her grueling routine, Ruth remained resolute in her pursuit of her goals. The restaurant where Ruth worked was renowned for its refined atmosphere and expensive menu. High-society clients frequented the establishment, and Ruth was used to serving influential people with grace and professionalism. However, one night, something extraordinary was about to happen. Among the reservations was a group of friends who stood out for their extravagance and luxury. As Ruth approached the table to take their orders, her heart nearly stopped when she came face to face with a woman who looked exactly like her. The resemblance was uncanny, almost as if she were staring into a mirror. Across the table, Rose was equally stunned when she saw Ruth. Never before had she encountered someone who resembled her so closely. The physical similarity was striking, and Rose, ever the opportunist, quickly began devising a plan. Something about this coincidence made her realize that this girl, so eerily similar to her, could be the solution to some of her problems. For the moment, though, she chose not to reveal anything, instead enjoying the dinner while subtly observing Ruth. Ruth, on the other hand, felt a mix of curiosity and discomfort. This woman who looked so much like her seemed to belong to a completely different world. Rose and her friends were dressed in expensive clothing, speaking loudly and exuding a lifestyle Ruth could barely fathom. Yet the undeniable resemblance between the two women was impossible to ignore. The coincidence felt too significant to dismiss, and Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was behind their unexpected encounter. Although she was there to work, this meeting sparked a curiosity in Ruth that she couldn't ignore. At the end of the dinner, Rose, already forming a plan, asked Ruth for her phone number, feigning curiosity about their resemblance. For Ruth, the approach was intriguing, and though hesitant, she shared her number, sensing this encounter was only the beginning of something bigger. As they left the restaurant, each woman carried different thoughts, both aware that their meeting would alter the course of their lives. For Ruth, it seemed as though destiny was beginning to unveil a new chapter, one filled with questions and surprises she couldn't yet comprehend. A few days after the strange meeting at the restaurant, Rose couldn't stop thinking about the waitress who was her exact double. The situation was too intriguing to ignore. Wasting no time, she called Ruth, disguising her curiosity as mere fascination with their physical resemblance. During the call, Rose suggested they meet for coffee and chat further. Ruth, though still cautious, agreed, thinking she might uncover some explanation for their unexpected encounter. When they finally met, the atmosphere was a mix of awkwardness and mutual curiosity. Seated in a cozy cafe, Ruth opened her heart. She shared with Rose the tragic events that had changed her life forever. She spoke about the loss of her family in the accident, her struggle to continue her education, and her exhausting routine of balancing school and work. As Rose listened, she appeared moved, but her mind was working rapidly. Ruth's story, full of pain and perseverance, stirred something within Rose, a recognition of a fight for survival she had never known herself. However, instead of genuine compassion, Rose saw Ruth as an opportunity, a key piece in solving her own problems. For Ruth, the conversation was a kind of relief. She felt comfortable sharing her story with Rose, as if their physical resemblance created an invisible bond. Yet, while Ruth spoke with sincerity, Rose was already devising her schemes. Ruth's chaotic life, with all its hardships, could serve a purpose. Always calculating, Rose saw a way to leverage this bizarre coincidence to her advantage. For now, she kept her intentions hidden, portraying herself as sympathetic and understanding. She knew that to manipulate Ruth, she first had to earn her trust. Rose, accustomed to solving everything with money and power, saw in Ruth an opportunity to escape her own life without raising suspicion. If Ruth were willing to cooperate, Rose could break free from her suffocating roles as wife and mother while maintaining her facade. But for this to work, Rose needed to tread carefully. She began showing friendly interest in Ruth, pretending to genuinely care about her struggles. The two talked for hours, and although Ruth remained guarded, Rose made a point to foster a connection. At the end of their meeting, Rose said goodbye with a warm smile and promises to keep in touch. For Ruth, the encounter had been a pleasant distraction from her difficult life, but she had no idea of Rose's true intentions. Rose, on the other hand, was satisfied with what she had achieved. With Ruth's trust beginning to build, she could now set her manipulative plan into motion. All she needed was a little more time to convince Ruth that their friendship could be mutually beneficial, all while keeping her ulterior motives hidden. After the cafe meeting, Rose spent the following days meticulously crafting her plan. The striking resemblance between her and Ruth was the key to solving all her problems. If Ruth could be convinced to take her place temporarily, no one would notice Rose's absence. This would give Rose the freedom to travel with Nolan and live the adventures she so desperately craved, without having to face the responsibilities she despised. It was the perfect escape. Ruth would step into Rose's life, taking care of the children and maintaining appearances with Jimmy, while Rose explored her newfound freedom without raising suspicion. The challenge now was convincing Ruth to agree to such an absurd proposal. Rose knew her twin sister was honest, hardworking, and ethical traits that would make her resistant to such a dishonest scheme. Ruth would never willingly accept something so rooted in lies and manipulation. Therefore, Rose needed a more calculated approach, one that would leave Ruth with no choice. In her Machiavellian mind, Rose began mapping out the necessary steps to ensure Ruth was cornered, with no escape but to assume Rose's role. To Rose, the plan was flawless. She imagined Ruth temporarily living her life, handling the responsibilities Rose had always loathed, while she enjoyed the world with Nolan, unburdened. Then, when she grew tired, Rose could simply return home and resume her place with Jimmy and the children as though nothing had happened. In Rose's eyes, this was just a game, a strategy to escape the boredom of a life she despised. But for it to work, Ruth needed to believe she had no other option but to accept the role Rose wanted to impose on her. Rose began planning another meeting with Ruth, this time with the intention of making her proposal. She knew she couldn't present the idea directly. She needed to carefully guide Ruth to a point of acceptance. In the days leading up to their meeting, Rose fine-tuned every detail. How to make Ruth believe this was her only way out and how to manipulate her emotions into accepting something so against her principles. With each step of the plan, Rose grew more confident in her ability to get what she wanted. After all, she had always been skilled at manipulating people to suit her needs. The true test was determining how far Ruth could be pushed. Rose understood the real difficulty lay in breaking Ruth's moral resistance, but she believed that, once backed into a corner, Ruth would have no choice but to relent. The upcoming meeting would be critical. Rose needed only to plant the right seeds and wait for the situation to unfold as planned. She was ready to put her scheme into action, indifferent to the consequences it would have on Ruth's life, Jimmy's trust, or even her children's well-being. Rose knew Ruth's integrity would never allow her to agree to such a plan voluntarily. Ruth's strong ethics made it clear she would refuse outright. But Rose, determined to live the adventurous life she dreamed of, decided to take a darker path. She would force Ruth to comply, and the best way to do that was to create a situation where Ruth had no way out. The scheme Rose began to devise involved ruining Ruth's reputation, staining her image so irreparably that Ruth would have no choice but to accept whatever solution Rose offered. The plan, though cruel, seemed perfect in Rose's eyes. The idea was simple. Ruth would be accused of a crime she didn't commit, and Rose would present herself as the only person capable of clearing her name. This would corner Ruth, leaving her no escape. To ensure the plan's success, Rose needed to construct a convincing scenario where Ruth would be caught red-handed, leaving no doubt of her guilt. Once the setup was complete, Rose would swoop in as the savior, offering help on one condition. Ruth would have to take her place, caring for Jimmy, the children, and the household, while Rose disappeared temporarily. Rose knew she had to act swiftly and precisely to make the plan work. She arranged a dinner with friends at a luxury restaurant, the same place where Ruth worked as a waitress. Everything was falling into place. Rose would bring a wallet stuffed with cash, conspicuously leave it out during the dinner, and then orchestrate a scenario to incriminate Ruth. At the right moment, Rose would excuse herself to the restroom, secretly placing the wallet in Ruth's bag. Upon returning, she would feign surprise, announcing the wallet was missing. When Rose alerted her friends about the missing wallet, everyone would look around in confusion. The police would be called, and a search would reveal the wallet in Ruth's bag. It was the perfect setup. A seemingly impeccable waitress caught red-handed. Ruth's professional reputation would be destroyed, and the scandal would spread quickly, making it impossible for her to find another job or clear her name without Rose's help. Rose calculated every detail. At the height of Ruth's desperation, Rose would present her proposal. She would drop the charges and prevent Ruth from going to jail, but the condition would be clear. Ruth had to step into Rose's life. She would care for Jimmy, the children, and the house while Rose traveled freely with Nolan, unburdened. Ruth, cornered and with no other options, would have to agree. Rose was convinced her plan was foolproof. She believed she was in complete control, certain that she would soon be living the life of her dreams, while her sister was trapped in a reality she never asked for. The execution of Rose's plan was as cold as it was calculated. When the police arrived at the restaurant and found the wallet in Ruth's bag, all eyes turned toward her with suspicion. The waitress who had been serving Rose's table was immediately accused, and the tension in the room escalated. Ruth, stunned, couldn't fathom how it had happened. She, who had always prided herself on her honesty and ethics, was now being treated like a criminal. The injustice was overwhelming, and there was no way for her to defend herself. The evidence was damning. Amid the chaos, Rose played the part of the concerned friend perfectly. With a facade of shock, she expressed her disbelief, claiming she never would have imagined such a thing. When the police threatened to arrest Ruth, Rose intervened, pretending to feel pity for the poor waitress and insisting she wouldn't press charges. Though Rose withdrew her complaint, the damage was already done. Ruth's name had been dragged through the mud, and her once spotless professional reputation was now irreparably tarnished. The restaurant, known for its emphasis on discretion and employee integrity, wasted no time in firing her. For Ruth, the blow was devastating. Not only had she lost her job, but her future now seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. It was nearly impossible to believe that, in just a matter of minutes, her life had been turned upside down. All the effort she had put into maintaining her dignity and pursuing her education now felt meaningless. How could she find another job with an accusation of theft hanging over her? Even without formal charges, the news would spread quickly, and no one would hire someone with such a heavy stain on their record. Rose, on the other hand, maintained her facade of benevolence, pretending to be concerned about Ruth's fate. She knew her plan was unfolding exactly as she had envisioned. Ruth was in a vulnerable position, jobless, with no prospects, and her reputation in ruins. All that remained was to deliver the final blow. Rose knew that at this point, Ruth would be desperate enough to consider any proposal that might offer her a way out. And that proposal was imminent. Rose's earlier decision to drop the charges had been strategic. It was a way to keep Ruth indebted to her, trapped by a sense of emotional obligation. That night, as Ruth returned home consumed by sadness and powerlessness, she struggled to process everything that had happened at the restaurant. Every effort she had made, every battle she had fought, now felt in vain. What Ruth didn't know was that the true betrayal was yet to come. Rose was preparing to knock on her door, bringing with her a proposal that would change Ruth's life forever. With the confidence of someone who had always controlled the fates of others, Rose was ready to take the next step in her devious plan. Later that evening, as Ruth sat in her small apartment trying to make sense of the chaos, there was a soft knock at the door. Opening it, she found Rose on the other side, her expression a strange mixture of sympathy and cold calculation. Still shaken by the accusation of theft, Ruth couldn't fathom what this woman, who looked so much like her, could possibly want now. Rose, however, was fully prepared to execute her final move. With a calculatedly calm tone, she began explaining why she was there. Ruth's shock would soon give way to a mixture of indignation and despair. Rose was direct. She admitted to orchestrating the entire theft incident, explaining that she needed Ruth but knew her sister would never willingly agree to her plan. "I knew you wouldn't agree on your own," Rose said with the coldness of someone who viewed life as a game. "Now you need me, and I can help you." Ruth could barely believe what she was hearing. The woman standing before her wasn't just her twin sister, but someone willing to destroy her life for her own selfish gain. Staggered by the revelation, Ruth tried to argue, but Rose had anticipated every counterargument. She laid out the situation plainly. The only way Ruth could avoid jail was by agreeing to the identity swap. If she refused, Rose would simply reverse her decision to drop the charges, leaving Ruth defenseless against the accusations. "You don't have another choice," Rose said with a cynical smile. The proposal was simple. Ruth would take over Rose's life, caring for her children, living with Jimmy, and maintaining appearances in the Walmart mansion. Meanwhile, Rose would be free to live her adventures with Nolan, far from the constraints of her family life. Completely cornered, Ruth found herself without options. The weight of the blackmail was crushing. She knew that if she went to jail, her life would be completely ruined. She wouldn't be able to continue her studies, find another job, or salvage her future. But agreeing to Rose's plan meant living a lie, betraying her own integrity, and sinking deeper into a nightmare she had never envisioned. The decision felt impossible. The moral and emotional dilemma was overwhelming, but reality was unforgiving. Sensing Ruth's hesitation, Rose pressed harder. She knew that every moment of silence heightened her sister's desperation. "I can help you, Ruth, but you have to help me first," Rose said, her words dripping with calculated cruelty. Ruth felt utterly powerless. Deep down, she knew Rose had orchestrated everything to leave her with no escape. With a heavy heart, Ruth realized she might have no choice but to do the unthinkable to salvage what little remained of her life. It was the perfect trap, and Ruth was about to fall into it. With the weight of the decision crushing her, Ruth finally succumbed to Rose's pressure. Cornered and unable to see any other way out, she agreed to the twisted proposal. She would take Rose's place, knowing that the alternative was jail, a ruined reputation, and the loss of any chance to rebuild her life. After tying up the loose ends of her former life, including paying off her modest apartment's rent, Ruth bid farewell to everything she had worked so hard to build. With a heavy heart, she made her way to the Walmart estate, where she would assume the role of Rose, the wife of Jimmy and the mother of William and Benjamin. The transition was unsettling for everyone. Jimmy, who knew every detail of his wife's personality, immediately sensed something was off. Ruth's demeanor, quieter and more reserved, contrasted starkly with Rose's extroverted and sometimes arrogant nature. The children, William and Benjamin, also noticed the change. They had grown accustomed to their mother's emotional absence, but the new Rose exhibited a warmth and patience that puzzled them. Ruth did her best to adapt, but every interaction reminded her of the immense weight of living a life that wasn't hers. The first few days were particularly challenging. Ruth tried to mimic Rose's gestures, speech patterns, and behaviors, but there were moments when the facade began to crack. Jimmy, though suspicious, couldn't pinpoint what was different. The Rose he saw now was more caring and attentive, and despite his initial unease, he began to appreciate these changes. The boys, who had often been neglected by the real Rose, were now receiving genuine affection and attention. Ruth, armed with the love and values instilled in her by her late family, devoted herself to caring for them in a way Rose never had. Despite her efforts to adapt, Ruth faced moments of intense anguish. Each time she looked at Jimmy and the children, she felt a mix of guilt and sadness. She was living a lie, a life she had never wanted. Yet she knew she had no other way out at that moment. Gradually, Ruth began to infuse the household with the values she had always been taught: love, patience, and dedication. She read bedtime stories to the boys, helped with house chores, and, surprisingly, started earning the respect of the household staff, who noticed the positive changes. What started as an obligation imposed by Rose slowly transformed into something deeper for Ruth. She began to grow attached to the family she was temporarily caring for, and despite living a lie, she formed bonds with the children and even Jimmy. However, the moral dilemma weighed heavily on her conscience. How long could she sustain this facade? And what would happen when Rose decided to return and reclaim her place? Ruth knew she was trapped in a web of deceit, but for now, she had no choice but to continue. As the days passed, Ruth dedicated herself more and more to her role as Rose, doing everything she could to keep up the charade. She knew she had to be convincing to avoid suspicion. Every day, she woke up early to help the staff with household tasks, something Rose had never done. She took the children to school, helped with their homework, and even read stories to William and Benjamin at bedtime. While she was doing her best to adapt to this new life, the differences between Ruth and Rose became increasingly apparent to those around her. Jimmy was the first to notice the changes. The woman he had married had always been superficial and uninterested in family responsibilities. Now, however, this new Rose displayed genuine interest in family life, cared about the children, and even helped with small household routines. The difference in behavior didn't go unnoticed, and while Jimmy appreciated this new version of Rose, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This woman seemed like a completely different person. The household staff also began whispering among themselves about the changes. The Mrs. Rose, who had once treated them with coldness and detachment, was now attentive and polite. She conversed with them, lent a hand when she could, and displayed a side of herself no one had thought existed. Murmurs began to spread among the staff, many wondering what could have caused such a drastic transformation. For Ruth, every day was a battle to maintain the facade, and the weight of living this lie grew heavier as suspicions started to arise. Despite the doubts in the air, Ruth continued playing her role with dedication. Each time she looked at the boys, her affection for them grew. She knew it wasn't her responsibility to care for William and Benjamin, but she couldn't help the love she was developing for them. In turn, the boys began gravitating toward the mother, who now seemed more loving and present. What Ruth offered naturally: care, patience, and love, Rose had never provided. Yet Ruth knew that the bonds she was forming with the boys would only make things more complicated when the truth eventually came to light. Day by day, Ruth felt more trapped in a web of lies. She didn't want to continue living this life, but she also didn't know how to escape it. The feelings she was developing for Jimmy and the children only made the situation more difficult. Despite all her efforts to mimic Rose, the differences between them were becoming increasingly obvious. The real question was, how much longer could she keep up this charade before everything fell apart? Ruth sensed that the end of this game of illusions was drawing near, and the weight of the choices she would have to make was beginning to suffocate her. As the days went by, Ruth unknowingly began to impress Jimmy in ways he hadn't expected. The new Rose not only demonstrated more affection for the children and a newfound attention to family life, but she also showed an unexpected aptitude for handling domestic and business matters. Jimmy, used to a wife who shirked responsibilities, began to notice how different Rose was becoming. She not only participated more actively in the family routine, but also stepped into business matters that Rose had always avoided. Ruth, with her discipline and work ethic, quickly stood out in the company. Even though her intention was only to maintain the charade, her competence didn't go unnoticed by Jimmy or the company's employees. In a delicate situation, when the workers threatened to strike due to grievances, it was Ruth who, surprisingly, took the initiative to organize a meeting. With calm and determination, she listened to their complaints, found solutions, and restored harmony within the company. Jimmy was impressed by her ability to mediate and lead, qualities he had never expected to see in Rose. However, as Jimmy began to admire this new side of Rose, the household staff grew increasingly suspicious. They murmured among themselves, questioning the behavior of a woman who had always been distant and even arrogant. To them, the change was too drastic to be a natural evolution of personality. The way Ruth treated the staff with respect, helping with chores and listening to their concerns, was completely unlike the real Rose, who had always treated them as inferiors. Doubts began to spread. Could this truly be the same person? Jimmy, though pleased with the changes, couldn't ignore the signs that something was amiss. He wondered what could have caused such a radical transformation in his wife, but at the same time, he didn't want to dig too deeply. After all, the new Rose was more present, loving with the children, and now even helping save the company from a crisis. The harmony that seemed to have been restored in his personal and professional life was a relief for Jimmy, who chose to believe this sudden change might be a second chance for their marriage. Ruth, however, felt the weight of guilt grow heavier with each passing day. Even as she earned Jimmy's respect and admiration, as well as that of the staff, she knew she was living a lie. The facade she upheld was becoming increasingly unbearable. Although she was beginning to grow attached to the family she was now caring for, she knew the time to confront the truth was drawing near. The tension between who she truly was and the role she was pretending to play grew stronger, and Ruth dreaded what would happen when everyone discovered the real Rose was no longer there. For now, she continued the charade, navigating a sea of secrets and uncertainties. As time passed, the bond between Ruth and Jimmy began to strengthen in unexpected ways. What initially seemed like a facade to save her own skin was transforming into something far more complex for Ruth. She wasn't just fulfilling her obligations as Rose. She was emotionally investing herself in Jimmy and the boys. With each passing day, Ruth felt more connected to the family, and the guilt of living a lie mixed with the genuine feelings blossoming in her heart. Jimmy, in turn, found himself increasingly captivated by this new Rose. The wife who had once been distant and superficial was now showing a loving, attentive, and resilient side he had never known. Jimmy couldn't fully understand the change, but he was willing to embrace it as a second chance for their marriage. He admired how Rose now devoted herself to their family and his business, drawing him closer to her. The affection Ruth showed the children, the time she spent with William and Benjamin helping them with homework and playing games, made Jimmy fall in love all over again, this time with a version of Rose he deeply respected and valued. The children, who had grown used to the indifference of the real Rose, were also bonding with Ruth. William and Benjamin began to notice how different this new mom was. She actively engaged in their lives, cared about their feelings, and treated them with a love and patience they had never known. For the boys, this change was a relief, and they grew closer to Ruth, forming deep emotional ties with the woman they believed was their mother. Meanwhile, Rose, living out her adventures with Nolan, was entirely oblivious to what was happening at home. She indulged in trips, parties, and escapades far from the responsibilities she so despised. To her, this time away from Jimmy and the children was an opportunity to live unrestrained, free from the burdens of being a wife and mother. Rose assumed that she could simply return and reclaim her place without issue when her adventures concluded. Little did she know that, in her absence, Ruth was building something far more meaningful and lasting with her family. Ruth, however, faced an increasing dilemma. She knew her presence there was a lie, a deception that placed her in an impossible position. Yet the feelings growing inside her for Jimmy and the children couldn't be ignored. Ruth found herself torn between the duty to reveal the truth and the longing to stay in the life where, for the first time, she felt she truly belonged. But Rose's return was inevitable, and Ruth knew that when that moment came, everything she had built could come crashing down, taking with it the new life she had unknowingly come to love. While Ruth played the role of wife and mother in the Walmart household, Rose was living the life she had always dreamed of alongside Nolan. Free from worries, the two traveled to exotic destinations, attended luxurious parties, and indulged in a life of excess. To Rose, this was the freedom she had always craved. With Nolan, She felt liberated from any responsibilities, unburdened by the weight of her domestic life with Jimmy and the children. Free from judgment, Rose seized every opportunity for adventure, spending large sums of money she had secretly siphoned from Jimmy's company over the years. Nolan, though charming and a willing accomplice in Rose's escapades, had his own financial interests at heart. He was well aware of the wealth Rose controlled and took full advantage of it. Together, they lived a life of pure indulgence and superficiality. Rose, however, saw this phase as temporary. To her, these adventures were a break from reality, a means to satisfy herself before returning to the life she secretly considered safe and perfect. She convinced herself that, when ready, she could effortlessly step back into her role as wife and mother, as if nothing had changed. Rose had no idea that while she squandered Jimmy's money on her travels, life at the mansion had changed completely. In her mind, Jimmy was still the loyal and ever-available husband. The children were well taken care of, and everything would be exactly as she left it when she decided to return. Rose believed she could reestablish her place in the family with ease. What Rose failed to realize was that her absence was causing irreversible consequences. She underestimated the impact Ruth's presence had on Jimmy and the children. While Rose believed she was in full control of her life, spending money Jimmy didn't even know was missing, seeds of a new reality were being sown in her home. Confident and arrogant, Rose assumed her husband and children had no other choice but to welcome her back. But little did she know how complicated her return would be. This false sense of security pushed Rose to prolong her adventure with Nolan. Each new destination and luxury distanced her further from reality. She believed the life she was leading was her right, a reward after years of being trapped in a role she never wanted. For Rose, Jimmy's money was merely a tool for her happiness, and she gave no thought to how her actions might affect the future of the company or the family. While she lived out her fantasies, time was running out, and her return home loomed, bringing with it an inevitable confrontation with the choices she had made. One of Rose and Nolan's wildest nights took a devastating turn. After a party filled with drinking and excess, they found themselves in a situation that would alter their lives forever. In the adrenaline-fueled haze of the night, with both of them intoxicated and reckless, Nolan drove them back to their hotel at high speed along a deserted road. The car lost control on a sharp curve and slammed into a wall. The impact was catastrophic. While Nolan miraculously escaped with minor injuries, Rose wasn't as fortunate. When the dust from the accident settled, Nolan, still dazed and confused, realized the gravity of the situation. Rose was unconscious, severely injured, with deep cuts and visible fractures. Panic overtook Nolan. Up until that moment, their life together had been driven by fun, luxury, and escapism. But now, faced with the sight of Rose clinging to life, he understood he wasn't prepared to deal with the consequences. What had once been a glamorous adventure had turned into a living nightmare. Unsure of who else to call, Nolan made the only decision he could think of. He called Jimmy. Although he knew the call would raise questions, there was no time to explain. Jimmy, who was at home with Ruth still posing as Rose, answered the phone without a clue of what to expect. Nolan's desperate voice on the other end of the line left Jimmy in shock. The chaotic words revealed the accident and the severity of Rose's condition. Struggling to comprehend the situation, Jimmy sprang into action, worried for the wife he believed to be safe and nearby. Nolan, frantic and trembling, tried to explain the accident, but Jimmy could barely process what he was hearing. His mind raced with questions. How could Rose be somewhere completely different from where he thought she was? What was going on? Without wasting more time speculating, Jimmy decided to head straight to the hospital Nolan had mentioned. He knew something strange was happening, but his immediate priority was ensuring his wife received the care she needed. Ruth, meanwhile, was consumed with panic upon hearing about the accident. The web of lies she had spun was on the verge of unraveling, and she feared the consequences of Jimmy discovering the truth. What initially seemed like just another reckless consequence of Rose's excesses was now becoming the spark for a series of revelations. The meeting between Jimmy, Ruth, and Nolan at the hospital would bring hidden truths to light, exposing long-buried secrets and leading to an inevitable confrontation between the two sisters. Little did Rose know, as she fought for her life in a hospital bed, that fate was piecing the puzzle together, setting the stage for events that would forever change everyone's lives. When Jimmy received Nolan's call, he already had a gut feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. However, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to uncover. Distraught and confused, he demanded that Ruth, or rather, the woman he believed to be his wife, give him a plausible explanation. Ruth, visibly shaken and weighed down by months of deceit, could no longer maintain the charade. Overcome with panic, and with tears streaming down her face, she began to confess the truth, something Jimmy could never have imagined. Ruth explained that she wasn't Rose and that she had been forced to take Rose's place because of their identical appearance. Through sobs and a trembling voice, she recounted how Rose had blackmailed and manipulated her into compliance. Rose, relentless in her pursuit of freedom, had orchestrated the entire plan, trapping Ruth by falsely accusing her of theft. Desperate to avoid prison and ruin, Ruth had reluctantly assumed Rose's identity to save herself. Jimmy, stunned and disbelieving, listened with a mix of shock and disbelief as Ruth laid bare the twisted scheme. The revelation shook Jimmy to his core. He couldn't fathom that the woman he had reconnected with emotionally over the past few months wasn't his real wife. The physical resemblance between the two had been enough to fool everyone, including him, but now, faced with the truth, he was at a loss for what to think or feel. On one hand, he was furious with Rose for orchestrating such a cruel deception. On the other, he was moved by the honesty and sacrifices Ruth had made. He understood that she had been coerced into this situation, which stirred a complicated mix of compassion and anger within him. Without further delay, Jimmy decided they needed to go to the hospital immediately. He had to see for himself what was happening. When they arrived, the sight of the two twin sisters side by side was almost surreal. Rose lay unconscious in a hospital bed, intubated and gravely injured, while Ruth stood nearby, identical in appearance but worlds apart in character. The physical likeness was striking, and seeing them together left Jimmy even more overwhelmed. Processing the reality before him seemed impossible. The shock of seeing the two women who looked so alike yet were so different raised a flood of questions in Jimmy's mind. How had this all happened without him noticing? How had his life become so entangled in lies and secrets? He looked at Ruth with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. Despite the emotional wreckage, he knew Ruth had ultimately been truthful and had also been a victim of Rose's manipulations. The dramatic intersection of the sisters' lives was about to unravel even more secrets, reshaping the future of everyone involved. Still reeling from the revelation of the sisters' switch, Jimmy found himself struggling to trust anyone or make sense of the situation. The sight of the two women, so alike and yet so different, demanded answers that went beyond what he could process alone. Determined to uncover how such a surreal turn of events had come to pass, Jimmy made what he felt was the most logical decision. He called Luna and Henry, Rose's parents, to help shed light on the mystery. He needed answers, and only they could provide clarity. When Luna and Henry arrived at the hospital, they were as stunned as Jimmy. They were led into the room where Rose was being treated, and when they saw Ruth standing beside their daughter, they froze. The shock of the twins' identical appearance was so overwhelming that Luna covered her mouth with her hands, while Henry stood silently, struggling to process what he was seeing. They knew a dark secret from the past was about to come to light, one they had kept buried for years but could no longer conceal. Under mounting pressure and Jimmy's demanding gaze, Luna and Henry had no choice but to confess what had happened so many years ago. With trembling voices and tear-filled eyes, they revealed the truth they had kept hidden. Rose was not their biological daughter but one of twin girls born to a woman named Abigail, who had worked as a maid in a wealthy family's mansion. When Abigail became pregnant by the family's patriarch, she was abandoned and cast out. Homeless and destitute, Abigail died shortly after giving birth to the twins. The girls were separated during adoption. Rose was taken in by Luna and Henry, while Ruth was adopted by another family in a distant town. The revelation shook Jimmy to his core. He could barely believe what he was hearing. Everything he thought he knew about his wife and his life now felt like a carefully constructed facade of secrets and lies. Luna and Henry, visibly remorseful, confessed that they had adopted Rose without ever telling anyone the truth, not even her. They had known about Ruth's existence but never sought out the other girl. Now, seeing the two of them side by side, they realized how deeply they had erred by keeping this truth hidden. Jimmy, overwhelmed and filled with a mix of anger and compassion, struggled to process it all. Rose had been raised in a web of lies, never knowing her true origins, and now it was all unraveling. Ruth, on the other hand, listened to the revelation with tears welling up in her eyes, coming to terms with the fact that she had spent her entire life unaware that she had a twin sister. It explained the inexplicable connection she had felt and the emptiness that always seemed to linger in her life. With all the secrets laid bare, Jimmy knew that the choices he made next would change everyone's destiny forever. Standing before their twin daughters in the hospital, Luna and Henry couldn't escape the weight of their guilt. The revelation of the whole truth reopened old wounds, and now they faced the consequences of their past decisions. Looking at Rose, gravely injured in her hospital bed, and Ruth, clearly emotionally shaken, they finally understood the depth of the impact their choices had caused. They knew they had failed as parents, not just by hiding the adoption secret, but also by not raising Rose with the affection and values she had so desperately needed. Luna, tears streaming down her face, admitted that she had always felt a distance between herself and Rose, something she could never overcome. Although she had given her adopted daughter everything money could buy, she had failed to provide what mattered most: time, love, and attention. Now, seeing where that lack of care had led Rose, Luna could no longer deny her responsibility. Henry, equally shaken, realized that he had believed luxury and comfort were enough to give Rose a good life. Now, he understood that the emotional void they created had directly contributed to the poor choices Rose had made. The hardest realization for Luna and Henry was admitting that their emotional neglect had shaped Rose's character in devastating ways. She had grown up without boundaries or the emotional foundation necessary to face life's challenges. Her decision to switch identities with Ruth and live a life of adventure was a direct reflection of the inner emptiness she carried. By fleeing responsibilities and choosing the glamour and thrill of a parallel life, Rose was simply trying to fill the void her parents had never addressed. Now, Luna and Henry could clearly see how much their actions had led to this outcome. As they acknowledged their mistakes, Luna and Henry also recognized the positive impact Ruth's upbringing in a loving and present family had on her life. Despite lacking Rose's luxuries and privileges, Ruth had grown up surrounded by strong values, love, and discipline. Now, Luna and Henry saw that what Rose had lacked was what Ruth had in abundance: a home filled with constant affection, where achievements were celebrated with love and challenges were faced together. The stark contrast between the two sisters was painfully evident, and Luna and Henry felt the bitter weight of their parental failures. With the truth exposed and their mistakes laid bare, Luna and Henry realized that, while they couldn't change the past, they still had a chance to make amends for the future. They knew they would have to face the consequences of their actions and find a way to repair the damage they had caused. But in that moment, all they could do was apologize and take responsibility. Jimmy, watching silently, felt a mix of sadness and relief. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Ruth, hearing all of this, experienced a whirlwind of emotions. Everything she had believed about her life was being turned upside down. She had never known she had a twin sister, and the fact that their biological mother had died under such tragic circumstances left her deeply shaken. At the same time, the mystery of her origins was finally resolved, though it didn't bring the relief she had hoped for. The twins' separation and Luna and Henry's decision to keep the secret felt like a cruel twist of fate, one that was now demanding its reckoning. As the revelations continued, Jimmy looked at Ruth and Rose, still struggling to process it all. The pieces of the story were finally coming together, but what it meant for the future remained unclear. Rose, unconscious in the hospital, was unaware of the storm her life of lies had unleashed. But for Ruth, who had been thrust into the center of this whirlwind of secrets, the truth was both painful and liberating. Now, the two sisters were united by a past they couldn't change, but the consequences still needed to be faced. The exposure of the past's secrets left Jimmy utterly stunned. He felt betrayed by the lies that had been kept for so long, yet he was also drawn into a mystery that demanded resolution. Abigail's story, the biological mother of Rose and Ruth, disturbed him deeply. Who was the man who had abandoned Abigail? How could he have been so heartless as to leave a pregnant woman to fend for herself? Jimmy knew he couldn't rest until he had answers. Determined, he decided to hire private investigators to dig deeper into Abigail's past and uncover the identity of the twins' biological father. The days that followed were filled with tension for everyone. While Rose fought for her life in the hospital and Ruth grappled with the revelations, Jimmy poured his efforts into the investigation. The detectives combed through old records and spoke with people who might have known Abigail during her time working at the mansion. As the investigation progressed, unexpected clues emerged, leading to a shocking discovery. Abigail had not been just any housemaid. She had worked for Jimmy's adoptive father. This new and unsettling connection added an entirely new layer to the unfolding story. When Jimmy learned of this revelation, it felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. The idea that his own family was so directly tied to Abigail's tragic fate left him speechless. The man he had always considered honorable, his adoptive father, had been the one responsible for destroying Abigail's life, the mother of the two twins. The weight of this discovery pressed heavily on his heart, not only revealing the identity of Rose and Ruth's biological father, but also forcing Jimmy to confront an unimaginable truth. His own family was at the center of the suffering endured by the sisters. This revelation placed Jimmy in a moral dilemma. He had always admired and respected the man who raised him, the man who gave him opportunities and prepared him to manage the family business. But now, Jimmy had to face the fact that this same man had caused the downfall of another family. Abigail, a young and vulnerable woman, had been cast aside and abandoned when she needed help the most. The consequences of those actions rippled through the lives of Rose and Ruth, and Jimmy knew he couldn't simply turn a blind eye to the truth. The detectives confirmed that Jimmy's adoptive father was the biological father of the twins, making Rose and Ruth the rightful heirs to the fortune that Jimmy now managed. This changed everything. The discovery reframed Jimmy's understanding of his own role in the story and deepened his connection to the sisters. He knew that the days ahead would require difficult decisions, but first, he needed to ensure that the full truth came to light and that everyone involved had a chance to confront the consequences of their actions. As Rose lay in the hospital, fighting for her life, the truths about her past and her family began to unravel around her. Though she remained intubated and in critical condition, Rose somehow became aware of fragments of the revelations taking place. Trapped between life and death, she sensed that her entire life had been built on secrets and lies that were now coming undone. Unable to communicate, Rose silently absorbed the weight of the unfolding story, along with the pain and guilt tied to her own choices. Meanwhile, Ruth stayed faithfully by Rose's side. Despite all the pain her sister had caused, Ruth harbored no resentment. Instead, she felt deep compassion for Rose, understanding that she too had been a victim of circumstance and a cruel destiny. Ruth held Rose's hand, cared for her tenderly, and silently offered the love Rose had never truly known how to receive. For Ruth, This was a moment of reconciliation, even if Rose couldn't speak. She clung to the hope that, in some way, her sister could feel the love in her final moments. Despite the doctor's best efforts, Rose's condition showed no signs of improvement. Days dragged on, and Ruth, Jimmy, and even Luna and Henry, who had also remained present, began to prepare themselves emotionally for the inevitable. Rose's body, weakened by the injuries from the accident and years of emotional neglect, could no longer endure. The end was near, and they all knew there was nothing more to be done. The cruel irony of it all was that just as the truth was finally emerging, Rose was on the brink of leaving this world, without the chance to redeem herself or rebuild the bonds she had broken. At last, on a quiet morning, the inevitable came to pass. Rose, who had spent so much of her life chasing illusions and escapism, passed away in the hospital, surrounded by the people she had once rejected. Ruth, her heart heavy, felt the profound loss of a sister she had barely known. Despite the lies and the hurt, Rose was a part of her, and her death left an irreplaceable void. Luna and Henry, overwhelmed by a mix of grief and guilt, mourned the loss of the daughter they had raised, fully aware that their own choices had contributed to this tragic end. Jimmy, meanwhile, felt a deep sadness. Though his marriage to Rose had been far from perfect, he had cared for her and, in the past few months, had begun to hope that things might have been different. Now, with her death, those hopes were extinguished, and the weight of the entire story bore down on him with crushing force. Rose's death marked the end of an era of secrets but also signaled the beginning of a new chapter, where Ruth, Jimmy, and everyone involved would have to find a way to move forward, carrying the bitter lessons that fate had imposed on them. In the wake of Rose's death, Ruth felt emotionally drained. There was so much to process. Discovering her twin sister, the burden of the lies that had surrounded their lives, and now, the finality of losing Rose. While sorting through her sister's belongings, trying to make sense of the chaos her life had become, Ruth stumbled upon a hidden diary among Rose's possessions. At first, she hesitated to open it. Perhaps it held something that could help her understand Rose's troubled mind, or maybe it contained a trace of regret or kindness that might redeem her memory. What Ruth found within the pages, however, was devastating. Rose's diary revealed a side of her sister that was far darker than Ruth had imagined. The entries detailed Rose's cold and calculated plans for the future, including how she had schemed to use Ruth to switch places with her, exploiting their physical resemblance to escape the responsibilities she so despised. But the most shocking revelation came when Ruth read about Rose's ultimate plan. After tiring of her adventures with Nolan and returning to her family life, Rose intended to eliminate Ruth. Yes, Rose had planned to kill her own sister, ensuring that no one would ever discover the truth about their switch. Each word in the diary felt like a dagger to Ruth's heart. Despite everything she had endured, she had clung to a shred of compassion for Rose. But reading those lines shattered that compassion entirely. Rose had not only used her in a calculated and cruel manner, but had also been willing to take her life without remorse. Ruth closed the diary, overwhelmed by a mix of pain, anger, and sorrow. The sister she had cared for in the hospital, the same one who was now gone, had been more than someone who made poor choices. She had been a real threat, a dangerous figure willing to risk everything to satisfy her selfish desires. Although the contents of the diary were devastating, they also brought clarity to Ruth. The truth, no matter how painful, was finally laid bare. There were no more illusions or hopes that Rose might have changed in the future. Ruth realized that her sister had been consumed by her own selfishness and inability to truly love, and the chance for reconciliation or redemption had died along with her. Now, all that remained for Ruth was the difficult task of moving forward, carrying the burden of all she had uncovered. With the diary closed in her hands, Ruth decided it was time to leave the past behind. She had been dragged into a life she didn't choose, enveloped by lies that nearly destroyed her. But now, with the truth exposed and Rose no longer in the picture, she could finally begin to rebuild her own story. While the path ahead was uncertain, Ruth knew she was ready to face the future, a future that, despite everything, could hold hope and, at last, peace. As time passed after Rose's death, life at the mansion began to stabilize, albeit under the shadow of the memories and revelations. Jimmy, who had experienced an emotional whirlwind, found solace in Ruth. From the moment she had taken Rose's place, even under duress, Jimmy began to notice Ruth's unique qualities. Her kindness, her dedication to the family, and, most of all, her genuine love for William and Benjamin. Over the months, Jimmy's feelings for Ruth deepened. He saw in her a strong woman who had overcome adversity with admirable resilience and realized he had fallen in love with her. Jimmy's decision to propose to Ruth was a carefully considered one. He knew that, despite the pain and confusion of the past, the future could be different. Jimmy didn't see Ruth as a replacement for Rose, but as a woman with whom he wanted to build a genuine life. Deep down, he knew Ruth had become a true part of the family in a way Rose never had. Watching the love she showed for the boys made it clear that Ruth was the right person to stand by his side. When he proposed, the sincerity in his words deeply moved Ruth. Ruth, who had also developed feelings for Jimmy during this time, was overcome with emotion at his proposal. She knew that what had started as a charade had transformed into something real. Ruth already loved the family, the boys, whom she now considered her own children, and Jimmy, who had proven to be a just, loving, and loyal man despite all they had endured together. Accepting Jimmy's proposal felt not only like the right thing to do, but also the natural next step in her journey of rebuilding her life. From that day forward, Ruth's life changed completely. Once a young woman barely able to support herself, she was now the heiress to the family's entire fortune, an empire Jimmy had managed with dedication. But more than that, Ruth had gained a new family, a home where love and loyalty prevailed. The boys, William and Benjamin, who already loved her as a mother, now officially saw her as an integral part of their lives. Ruth felt blessed to have found a second chance, even though the road to that point had been anything but smooth. As the years went by, Ruth and Jimmy built a life together filled with peace, love, and companionship. Ruth never forgot the lessons she learned from her adoptive parent, the value of hard work, honesty, and caring for those we love. She carried these values into her life with Jimmy and instilled them in their children, always grateful for the chance to start anew. With her marriage solidified and life stabilized, Ruth took it upon herself to raise William and Benjamin in the same way her adoptive parents had raised her. To Ruth, the teachings of her childhood were invaluable, and now, as a mother, she felt it was her mission to pass those lessons on to the boys. She understood that, despite growing up in an environment of luxury and comfort, the boys needed to learn the true meaning of effort, work, and, above all, humility and love for others. With love, discipline, and faith, Ruth began to shape the lives of William and Benjamin. An important part of Ruth's routine with the boys was taking them to church on Sundays. She wanted them to grow up with a strong spiritual foundation, just as she had. For Ruth, faith had always been a pillar in her life, sustaining her through the hardest times. Taking William and Benjamin to church was her way of teaching them that, beyond material success, it was essential to have a grateful heart and a life guided by strong principles. Gradually, the boys embraced this routine and came to value the moments of reflection and spirituality they shared as a family. Ruth also believed in the power of responsibility and discipline as cornerstones of character development. From an early age, the boys were given small daily tasks at home, tidying their rooms, setting the table, taking care of their toys. These small responsibilities taught them the importance of contributing to the well-being of the household and respecting the work of others. Ruth knew these practical lessons, however simple, would significantly shape how William and Benjamin viewed the world as they grew older. Ruth's involvement extended to their education. She made it a point to be present at every stage of their academic development, helping with homework and actively participating in school meetings. For Ruth, it was crucial that the boys understood the value of learning and dedication to their studies. She encouraged them to be curious, to explore their talents, and, above all, to persevere through challenges in their academic lives. To her, education was one of the greatest gifts she could give her children. Additionally, Ruth ensured that William and Benjamin visited Jimmy's company once a week. She wanted them to understand the value of hard work and responsibility from a young age. Observing their father managing the business and learning how decisions were made in the corporate world became part of the boys' education. For Ruth, it wasn't just about preparing them for a financially secure future, but about teaching them to respect work and recognize that every success is built on effort and dedication. The story of Rose and Ruth serves as a powerful reminder of how our choices can shape not only our lives but also the lives of those around us. Fate, relentless and full of surprises, brought the sisters together after a lifetime of separation, revealing painful secrets and truths that forever altered their paths. While Rose lived a life marked by selfishness and the consequences of her lies, Ruth found strength in love, honesty, and faith, rebuilding her life alongside Jimmy and the boys she cherished so deeply. In the end, Ruth turned a story of suffering into one of redemption, proving that even amidst chaos, there is always room for forgiveness and rebuilding. The past, filled with pain and mistakes, did not define Ruth's future. She shaped it with the values she carried in her heart. The journey of both sisters teaches us that while secrets have the power to destroy us, the truth, no matter how painful, can set us free. If you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotion, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other incredible narratives like this one. Keep following along and discover how stories of resilience, love, and forgiveness can inspire change in our lives.